Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. It's episode 2592 of The Tom Woods Show. And I'm very glad to welcome for the very first time to the show, J.D. Haltigan, who holds a Ph.D. in developmental psychology from the University of Miami in Florida. And I follow him on his quote-unquote X account. And it never ceases to both entertain and inform me, so much so that I singled out his account to point out to my wife. And I said, you should follow this guy. And she started following you. And just the other day, she said, thank you for that recommendation. I'm really enjoying following him. So welcome to the show.
Well, thanks so much, Tom, for that wonderful introduction. Great to be with you. I've likewise followed you, and I know a number of my other colleagues and folks have been on with you before. So it's great to finally be on and to just have the opportunity to talk about a lot of the issues that are kind of percolating in the culture.
There's so many. I mean, if you and I were just sitting down over coffee, the coffee would turn into breakfast, would turn into lunch, would turn into dinner. We would just keep on going. So I'm going to have to impose some discipline on this conversation. But in particular, I want to start. Let's start with your field. Let's start with your field, right? Because I think a lot of us, and my field is history, and I feel like there's so much wrong with my field. If you go to a meeting of the American Historical Association, you'll lose your mind because the panels are all predictable. They're all on the predictable topics. So many of the traditional fields of American history anyway, diplomatic history, intellectual history, military history, those are all long gone because they're not fashionable anymore. And you know what has replaced them. And so a lot of us in the historical profession who have kept our sanity, we grouse about this and we start our own parallel institutions and this and that. But then we look around and we take a bizarre comfort in knowing, oh, don't worry, every academic institution is insane. Every discipline's crazy, not just the historians. So talk to me about the state of your profession, of your field, your corner of academia. What are the pluses and minuses right now?
Well, it's certainly, since 2013, I would say, became extremely woke and toxic in mental health research, psychology research, psychiatry research. A number of sort of pivotal key issues sort of were kind of lead motifs regarding that. The gender stuff has certainly been one, but just mental illness in general, how we talk about it, the language that we use to talk about it has been heavily censored, or there's been attempts to remake what we consider to be mental illness to normalize some forms of what previously would have been considered mental illness and what still really is. So sort of a very leftist view of culture and the way we define the topic matter in mental health. And it's been concerning because if you speak out against it, you've been censored, you've been shut down. The research itself has been heavily scrutinized. Papers have been retracted for dealing with really, key issues regarding the gender stuff, and even some stuff within mental health disparities across races and ethnicity. So it's been quite insane. Now, I will say that in the last year and a half, there's been the pushback, and of course, the election has sort of, I think, facilitated a more free ability to speak out about some of this stuff. So there is sort of a pushback coming. But it's been long overdue, and we have a lot to correct in the field, beginning with, as you kind of mentioned, conferences, what's allowed to be published and researched without censorship. And so I think we have a lot of work to do, but there is sort of a little bit of a hope that now that the sort of veil of censorship is being lifted and the culture is starting to push back a little bit, that we can change back to what we would consider a normal, healthy, scientific discourse in psychology and mental health.
What would you say are examples of what's wrong other than issues related to transgenderism, or is that the primary issue?
I mean, I think that's the primary one, but there's been a whole host of sort of leftist ideology regarding how we define mental illness, for example. And it's something as simple as, how do we define courses in psychology that are dealing with abnormal psych anymore? So, courses typically at the undergrad level, you might have had an abnormal psych course dealing with psychological disorders, but that was considered stigmatizing. And so there was a push to rename it problems in living. And that's sort of one sort of, bizarre example of other things in the field that have become similarly mutated to kind of be less stigmatizing in a way that is not really helpful. In other words, you have to call mental illness what it is in order to treat it, assess it effectively, and research it effectively. So that's just one example. But what do we consider mental illness anymore? How do we define it? What is the language that we use to define it? So the leftist view of that is very sort of, we have to use language that doesn't overly stigmatize or doesn't overly, impugn the individual that might have a mental disorder. But it's gone so far that this sort of destigmatization mindset has led to a normalization of mental illness. And once you normalize the acceptance of it, you end up with civic degradation like you see in New York, where there's just mental illness that's allowed to spill out onto the street, and you can't have any, forced voluntary confinement. So, and I've written quite a bit of that on my Substack. So I think that's sort of a more broad 360 aerial view of kind of what's been happening. And certainly there's also, there's this notion of health equity. So if you have disparities across races or ethnicities and any type of physical or mental health ailment, it's considered, we have to always find reason for that to be in the social environment, or the culture is responsible for causing that disparity rather than something intrinsic to the person like their biology or their genetics. So that idea that it's a sick society rather than something intrinsic to the individual has been, a huge leftist push in the last 4 or 5 years. And I think it's now coming back to the realization that no, it's a biopsychosocial model in terms of all mental and physical health. And you have to understand that there's not just a social contribution, but there's also biology and genetics that we have to account for. And you can't deny that role in contributing to mental illness and so forth.
I would presume that this idea that that some of these problems derive from there being underlying problems with the society at large, then in turn is used to justify political activism by people in your field who say, well, if we're going to ever get these people well, we're going to have to fix the society that's made them unwell.
That's exactly correct. And that's kind of the whole notion dating back even to when Christopher Lasch was writing about social ailments and so forth. And so the idea is that society is sick, so we have to change society rather than the individual. And you end up with social justice activism, you end up with political activism, leftist activism and ideology. So basically the whole idea is that society is to blame, and things like systemic racism or these sort of phantom concepts that we need to change or implement policy for, rather than treating the individual or dealing with something intrinsic to the person, rather than society being to blame for the cultural ailments at scale. So it's exactly that. But most of mental health, a lot of it in the last 5 to 6 years, until recently, as I mentioned earlier, it's gotten to be just social justice activism. Mental health has become an activist breeding ground. Systemic racism, toxic whiteness, these sorts of things have been bandied about in not just in textbooks, but in trainings and seminars. And it's gotten so ridiculous that, it's just absurd. And so now people are beginning to speak out. Psychologists have had enough. The APA has disgraced itself. The APA being the American Psychological Association. They've revealed themselves to be nothing more than a leftist activist outlet for the last 2 decades, attacking masculinity and so forth. So that sort of ethos has really degraded the field, and now you're seeing a lot of pushback to that.
At the same time, the problem that presents for people like you and even people like me not in your profession is that one can, with some justice, say, well, the professional association itself says A, B, and C. They say that the modern gender theory is sensible and based in science. And so who are you to dispute it? So it undermines somebody like you who's trying to put forth a different view.
Yeah, it's basically left-wing authoritarianism. And so you can't challenge any of the dogma coming from these sort of quote unquote, elites. They're in these institutions or in these organizations. And because they're so dominated by leftist people, they will censor you. It's become a complete, homogeneous organization. So there is no political dissent or dissent regarding the particular views that are being pushed or allowed. So you end up with just these sort of, ideological echo chambers, and people are leaving the organizations as a result. And so it does undermine people like myself and other researchers, but you have to push back against it and call it out for what it is. And the sort of, what X has allowed, Twitter, formerly Twitter, now X, has allowed is for a lot of these people in academia to speak out and to expose a lot of this ideological activism in these organizations. And it's not just the APA, it's many, the Behavioral Genetics Associations, the Society for Research and Child Development. And so when you're able to push back in that manner, there is an ability to hopefully turn the tide a little bit.
Well, let's say a little something, because you do post quite a bit about issues relating to gender. And so let me play devil's advocate here. Why couldn't somebody say, look, man, what somebody decides to do with his or her own body it does not have any direct impact on you. And even if, now no one's willing to concede this, but suppose they were, even if it turns out that the various procedures that they want done on themselves are going to do them harm, well, they're going to have to live with that harm because they made the decisions. How does it affect you to the point where you feel the need to pontificate about it publicly?
Well, I think, if that were the case, that they were doing their own thing and it was adults and they were sort of living their own life, that would be one thing. But we don't see that. We see them trying to force this sort of pseudo-reality upon everybody else with, men and women's spaces and so forth and so on. I mean, Nancy Mace's sort of issue on Capitol Hill with, men and women's restrooms is a good example of this. And not only just that, they're trying to force that sort of pseudo-reality on the rest of the normal population. So they're not just doing their thing and letting everyone be. They're trying to force that as the norm on everybody else, which is sort of like an inversion of reality. And then you have the second layer of this, which is children. So adults doing what they want to themselves is one thing, but when you have so much of this now impacting children who are being propagandized to by, ideologues, gender ideologues, and vulnerable children at that. So children who have mental illness, particularly mood issues, affect regulation issues, those are the individuals that are prone to that propagandized material to then begin questioning, their identity or thinking that changing their identity or their gender is going to lead them to some, amelioration of their sad affect or their mental illness. And so that's really a crisis because you are engaged, you have these children who are under this false cognition of they can change their sex. And when they begin to do that physically by modifying their body, that's irreversible. And so whether it's puberty blockers or actual physical surgeries, the damage that is doing to young people is catastrophic in the long run. And you're seeing that now with a lot of the detransitioners coming out on places like X and in the public sphere and documenting the toll that this has taken on them. So you have a whole vulnerable population of children who are being propagandized to, and it's not just a matter of, okay, these people who are confused about their gender are just doing their own thing and they're not really impacting anybody else in society.
Hey everybody, ready to optimize your nutrition this year? Factor has chef-made gourmet meals that make eating well easy. They're dietitian approved and ready to heat and eat in 2 minutes so you can feel right and feel great no matter what life throws at you. Factor arrives fresh and fully prepared, perfect for any active, busy lifestyle. Lose up to 8 pounds in 8 weeks with Factor Keto meals based on a randomized controlled clinical trial with Factor Keto. Results will vary depending on diet and exercise. With 40 options across 8 dietary preferences on the menu each week, it's easy to pick meals tailored to your goals. Choose from preferences like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, or Keto. Factor can help you feel your best all day long with wholesome smoothies, breakfasts, grab-and-go snacks, and more add-ons. Reach your goals this year with ingredients you can trust and convenience that can't be beat. I personally go to the gym at 11 a.m., so it's lunchtime when I'm done. And knowing I have lunch ready to go at home in just a few minutes keeps me from making, well, let's call them suboptimal decisions. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/Woods50off and use code Woods50off to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping. That's code Woods50off at factormeals.com/Woods50off to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. Do you have the sense that, at least on a small scale, this movement might be a little bit in retreat in the same way that DEI seems like it's a little bit on the defensive and in retreat? Or is this still 2 steps forward, 1 step back?
No, I would say it's definitely in retreat, and it's in retreat because of the pushback that's being received, the ability to speak a little bit more freely about it, and people are coming out now and they've had enough. And not just people that are in the academic milieu like myself, but parents have had enough and they're speaking out about it. And so the more that you build that sort of counter coalition to come out and say, look, this is insane, the more you're able to sort of call it out. And certainly some of the more bombshell reports about NIH funding that was used to fund gender research that basically was research that was sort of falsified and or, censored in a way to promote the ideology rather than to promote the data that really was true data and showed true results. So you had recently one of those with Olson Kennedy, who had a big NIH grant that was used inappropriately and to a certain degree with the way they handled the data, the way they included the data and what it was said. So the more you have that pushback and that sort of public exposure of the malfeasance that's going on, that they have no place to go because it is built on a pseudo-reality, a complete inversion of really what normative functioning is like. And so there's nowhere to go but in retreat. Now, to a certain extent, I'm sure there will be some, give and take, and the battle won't be completely won overnight, but there has to be that pushback and that sort of exposure about how completely corrupt this whole gender ideology scheme has been from the start.
Do you think this movement, this transgenderism, do you think that this has been a purely organic movement that has grown up spontaneously from the population? Do you think it has been imposed from above? Do you think it's both? And if it's been imposed from above, by whom? People in the state? People in the culture? How do we account for it?
Well, I think there's always been the sort of heavily radical feminist movement that sort of wanted to abolish sex roles and any notion of the sex binary. I've written a little bit about that on my Substack. And you've also had a very small proportion of the population that had what was considered gender dysphoria. It was usually mostly males a very small percentage. But what happened is social media and social contagion. And so once you have social media spreading this sort of ideology that you can change your gender, or that might be the root of other mental health issues, that's really what's amplified what was really a small problem into a larger monstrosity. And so you had a number of things that really led to the movement. You had radical feminism, and of course you had, J.K. Rowling has pointed this out, that you've had males in positions of power that have sort of funded a lot of this stuff in the gender industry. So it's both, but you have really what I see as sort of this, a few key figureheads in the radical feminist movement, as well as big heavy donors that have funded the gender medicine industry. And then you have these sort of millions of foot soldiers who are propagandists and who are ideologues, who are all over Twitter, I should say TikTok, not Twitter as much, but they are propagandizing to children. Jeffrey Marsh on TikTok is another good example of that. I was just tweeting J.K. Rowling that today. But you have an ethos in social media and also in the schools where this stuff is being promoted as normal. And that is very detrimental to children who are vulnerable, who are at a normal transition in the adolescent period when, you would normally question your identity, but not with this sort of pseudo-reality stuff that's being pushed on them now around gender. You have courses in elementary school questioning the gender binary. So there's a lot that's gone into the mix that led to this. I would say the core goes back a couple of decades with radical feminism and sort of the stuff around, could we change or could we treat gender dysphoria? John Money is another key figurehead. He was a psychiatrist who essentially was trying to treat an individual living as a different sex, and that didn't turn out well. He's usually pointed to as sort of a key male figure. And then you have people like the Pritzkers who give lots of money to the gender medicine industry. So it's a mix of factors, but what's really amplified the gender ideology arm of it is social media and what's been going on TikTok and other places like that, live blogging. And you might even point to places like Tumblr as sort of a focal origin point for a lot of where this came from.
Do you see patients in private practice, or are you academic only?
So I'm a researcher. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I do work adjacent with and in concert with clinical psychologists and clinical psychiatrists, because a lot of the research that we do obviously informs how they see, assess, and treat mental illness. So I don't see patients, but a lot of the data that's collected on patients is what I analyze. So looking at the configurations of mental health symptoms, how do we define mental illness? Do we look at it as more categorical in nature or continuous? That is, you typically think of mental illness as mental disorders as categorical entities, but they're really not in nature. We all have a little bit or a little less of these symptoms. And it's really mental illness is when those symptoms get to a certain threshold that they become problematic. So how do these symptoms cohere together? And I do a lot of sort of statistical modeling of those symptoms. So it's really looking at the architecture of mental health and mental illness, as opposed to somebody coming in and saying, I need some help with what's going on in my life, that kind of thing.
Okay. Depending on how you answered that, I was going to go down different roads. I want to ask you then a question that may sound flippant, and I genuinely don't mean it to be, but surely, or at least there's a good likelihood that you saw sometime within the past year, an article that or a summary of a study that seemed to indicate that people who describe themselves as left-wing politically are much more likely to be diagnosed with some kind of a mental disorder. And I wonder, number one, if you think there's anything to that, and number two, could we explain that away as, well, the left, much more than the right, has been willing to subject itself to the people who belong to the political left are much more open to the idea of psychotherapy, for example. And people on the right tend to be more skeptical. So, well, yeah, when there are fewer patients, fewer people will present with disorders. Do you think there's anything to this? And if so, what's the explanation?
So I do think there is something to this. I've written, again, a lot about this on my Substack at jdhaltigan.com. And I think we have to first start from the perspective of what is the left right now. These sort of notions of left and right have become so hazy now in the recent last, say, 5-6 years. When we talk about the left, we're really talking about the radical progressive left, the AOC sort of, arm of the left-wing democratic machine, not your typical classical liberal. And once you get onto the radical left, you do get what I would consider to be cluster B psychopathology. So these disorders are considered under the umbrella of what we consider personality disorders like histrionic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, to name a few. And what they all have in common is sort of this idea of emotional dysregulation. And that's really what characterizes this radical progressive left right now. So it's not just a matter of them coming in to, let's say, psychotherapy, treatment centers and saying we need help. It's just that sort of psychopathology, that inability to regulate their emotion properly, is what characterizes this radical fringe left, much more so than even the fringe right. And you can think of environmental activism. You can think of what we saw in 2020 in the rioting. And you can look at some of the political actors who are on the radical progressive left, and they all have this sort of emotional dysregulation, street theater, histrionic personality about them, whether it's borderline, whether it's narcissistic personality disorder. And that really is what characterizes this radical progressive left that is not just politically sort of in the mainstream, but also within academia. It's a complete inability to regulate or emotion, or a sort of a use of emotion to manipulate and to impose this ideology that we've been talking about. So I do think there's definitely something to that. The degree and extent is something I'm still, thinking about, but, I have a number of pieces, again, that, I talk about on my Substack. They get right into the heart of that's really what the left is now. It's just sort of this amalgamation of emotional dysregulation psychopathology.
Hey, everybody, I'd like to tell you about my friends at Federated Computer, who are changing the way businesses buy software. We all need software to run our business, but the best business software doesn't have to cost thousands of dollars each month. The typical Federated Computer customer saves 75% or more on their software bill and gets great software, top-notch customer service and support, and a software solution that is uniquely installed for your business without any surveillance or breaches of privacy. For example, if you use Google for email, Salesforce for CRM, Slack for team chat, ListMonkey for customer communications, and Airtable for data management, with a team of 10, you'd save $9,000 per year on software costs switching to Federated Computer. And what is wild, the cost of Federated Computer doesn't grow as your team grows. You can use your Federated Computer savings to grow your business rather than feed the woke Silicon Valley software companies. The Federated Computer team invented computing in the cloud. Now they're taking a hammer to the ridiculously high prices of business software and have many, many satisfied customers to prove they deliver. Federated Computer has been a longtime supporter of The Tom Woods Show, and they're offering 30% off their already low prices when you use coupon code WOODS. Go to www.federated.computer to save 75% or more on your monthly software costs. That's www.federated.computer. These folks are going to do you a big favor. Check them out. Do you think there are any mental health disorders that are being overdiagnosed?
I would sort of, I really haven't thought deeply about that. I mean, one that comes to mind is maybe autism now. We've gone from sort of diagnosing severe cases of autism with mental retardation, to now everybody under the sun might have autism. ADHD is another one under that rubric. And whether that really reflects an increase in the number of cases or just softening of the diagnostic criteria is something that I think remains to be seen. But certainly we've gone to a society in which whether or not there's an overdiagnosis, there's sort of a medicalization of ordinary life. And, we talked a lot about that during COVID. Marty McCary talked about that with sort of this, how do we handle treating mild colds and so forth and so on. So I think it's part of that larger over-medicalization of ordinary life rather than any sort of one or two focal diagnoses that are being overdiagnosed. I guess I would say if you had to point to one or two, probably autism and ADHD.
All right. I want to get into something that you've talked about on your feed and in some of your writing. That involves social media and particularly young people, because social media is something the human race never had. And within one human lifetime, nobody even heard of it. I mean, we are at the very, very beginning of something. And there's no guarantee that a novelty like this is going to turn out to be a net positive. There are positive benefits of it. I wouldn't have found out about you if it weren't for social media platforms. So they can certainly be put to good use. Now, Jonathan Haidt has advanced the argument that a contributing factor to a rise in anxiety and depression among young women has been social media. But then I had another expert on my show who said the research is very sloppy on that. So be that as it may, nevertheless, though, there are other ways in which it seems to me that let's say an unrestricted access to social media could damage kids. And just one of them is the contagion effect that you have, for example, an idea like transgenderism, but it doesn't have to be just that left on its own to percolate in the absence of social media might not have spread as fast as it did. But suddenly we now have these communication channels that can reach directly into a child's room and say, the source of your unhappiness is gender dysphoria, which would be words they would never have heard otherwise. So what do you think has been the net effect of the, living online on impressionable kids?
I think that the net effect is probably going to be one of certainly a negative relationship to living online and mental health. The question is, what's the magnitude of that? And certainly you pointed out that, there are positive effects to being online. I think that the key moderator in all of this is probably going to be things like sex, biological sex, age, and so forth. So how competent is one able to navigate living this sort of online reality now, as opposed to, being in the real world or in real life, as we like to call it. So I think that both things are true. I think that, Haidt's argument is sort of compelling at the population level. When you're looking for causal effects, it becomes very murky. The research is problematic. In fact, we're on sort of, there's a paper going around now that has a number of different experts on a consensus statement that's being developed around social media and mental health. And there is a diversity of opinion on a lot of these different questions. I think the net effect is, as I mentioned, it's going to be probably at least initially negative. And the degree to which there's a negative relationship between living online and mental health, I'm not quite sure how large it will be. But we're also in a period now where we're sort of undergoing what might be considered the human species adapting to this new reality. So we really can't adjudicate the effects until things shake out much longer down the road. Certainly, young people who have other issues going on are going to have less ability to navigate living online maybe as competently as someone who has sort of a stable structure around them and who's able to, excise themselves from living online and force themselves into the real world. So It is murky. It is murky. I will say that one basic thing you can say is that everybody looking at screens all the time, whether it's in their office, at a restaurant, that's going to have an effect on how we communicate visually, emotionally. It's just how do you go about rigorously studying that? That's really going to be a key issue moving forward in how we understand the impact of these social media screens on mental health overall. And not just mental health, but how we really orient ourselves to the world, how we navigate the world, because increasingly we're living online more and more. That's just the reality. And so we won't know these sort of ramifications of that until a little bit later down the road when there's more data collected and we're able to sort of analyze it in a way that makes sense of that data appropriately.
You can imagine a world in which this new technology is purely benign. That it gives me an opportunity to be exposed to a wide range of perspectives that I can evaluate. It gives me a chance to debate with people and exchange ideas. It gives me a chance to expand my horizons, to have books at my fingertips that I might never have heard about. There's so many ways you can think of it as being positive. And yet at the same time, I personally feel that it contributes, in my case, to an increase in agitation. Because frankly, I don't want to know how many stupid opinions there are out there. I don't want to know exactly what I'm up against at the time. But yet when I scroll, that's what I see. Even when you very, very carefully curate your X feed, some of your friends are responding to dummies. So you have to see that. And I don't mean to say that I need to be shut off from all competing points of view, but the competing points of view today are not, should we tax people 30% or 38%? The competing points of view are radically different worldviews, radically different visions of what a human being is. And it's like every single time I turn this thing on, I have to justify my first principles. And it's doggone it, it's exhausting.
I share that exact same sentiment 100%. And I think part of it is our natural instincts to want to partake in discussion, to want to have mental stimulation, to want to be involved in the discourse in the public square. So it pulls in a way for our own personality dispositions, which are probably competitive, which are probably a little bit more disagreeable, and we want to be in that mix. So it taps into that. But at the same time, you do see that, utter lunacy, and it is toxic. And you also realize, and you can see quite clearly, who is leveraging the platform in a way that is dishonest and engagement farming. And you can see that sort of percolate right out. And that's another thing that agitates. So you have a number of actors on there who are not about engaging in good faith, or you question their principles, and so that can be another source of agitation. But one of the arguments that a lot of these fringe identities make is that, well, they can go online and they can find other people like them and develop these communities that make them feel better. But that, in a way itself, it just is self-reinforcing their own pathology, and that is, it's not exposing them to the real world and other people. And so if you get in these ideological echo chambers, or you get in these groups where all you're being is affirmed, or you're being told that how you think is right, that's just going to reinforce and only harden and crystallize their psychopathology. But one of the things that just, I think, for everyday people who may not be on there to find their niche group, is just what you said. You log on and you realize that this techno-mediated public square is now crucial to how we shape the culture. And there's no way around it. So when I started this conversation with you, I was saying, well, the one way we're pushing back in academia is by use of the social media square. And it is a toxic place. There's no way about it, but you have to be on it if you want to change the culture. And so it's a double-edged sword. It is exhausting. It's exhausting in a way that's much different than sort of the blue-collar laborer who comes back from a shift, working as a landscaper. They're physically exhausted, but this is sort of mentally exhausting because, like you say, you're not engaging in good faith. You see complete lunacy, but yet at the same time, it's pulling you back in all the time.
Yeah, boy, isn't that the truth? Well, if your field were in, let's say, more robust health, how do you think at its best it could be contributing to the improvement of society, particularly in this day and age? What could it be doing when it's at its very best?
When it's at its very best, it's accurately identifying, assessing, and treating mental illness. And it's doing so in a way that is best at scale for cultural and healthy civic hygiene and civic functioning. So if you had a mental health field that was functioning at its optimal best, you wouldn't have places like New York City having people getting lit on fire in the subways. You might have isolated incidents of things, but not at the scale we're seeing. And sort of this destigmatization, this cultural normalization and tolerance of mental illness, this idea that the institutions were always to blame, and that, for example, the mental health institutions were places of rampant abuse. Yeah, there were cases of that, but you can't dismantle the whole institution or you end up with what you see in New York City, what you see in Chicago. And the same goes for things like restorative justice and the idea that you have sort of criminals are now being rebranded as justice-involved individuals. It's lunacy. And you end up with what you see in Chicago, just rampant crime on the streets where there's no penalties, disparities across ethnicities and who contributes to crime is considered, if you identify them, you're considered a racist or a sexist. It's complete insanity. And so we need some authority in these mental health institutions to say what is and what isn't mental illness and just be clear about it. And yeah, you can have debate within that, but at the end of the day, you have to have limits. And if you don't have any limits on behavior or how man expresses his own idiosyncrasies and personality dispositions, you end up with a culture in crisis. I mean, the great sociologist Philip Reeve said that. And so you have to have limits, and you have to have people in positions of authority that can set those limits, not as sort of authoritarian fascists, but people who have the expertise to do so in a way that, is true to the science.
Where do you think look, the gender thing is obviously overwhelming right now in terms of the attention being given to it by mental health professionals, and they give it the wrong kind of attention. But are there any areas of your field where you feel like I wish there were good or better and more research on, or are there promising avenues of research that you find interesting or you wish there was more of?
Well, I think the key thing in the area of mental health that we need to research and continue to push forward is what are the respective contributions of the social environment, parenting to mental illness versus how much of it is just really deterministic and genetic and biological. So the key research that needs to be done is really methodologically rigorous work that looks at mental illness and tries to understand from a causal perspective what is leading to it. And the first thing you need when you understand or when you want to research mental health is you have to have clear boundaries about how you define mental illness. If you don't have the construct you want to understand clearly defined, you can't study it. And so that's part of the problem right now is all these constructs about what is and what isn't mental illness are just they're tempted to being redefined by the left. And that's led to insanity because you can't research what you don't know something is. So we need to get back to basics about classical nosology in terms of what is and what is not a mental illness, and not have these fuzzy boundaries. Yes, you have them inherently, but you can't have them to such a degree that you can never define what is and what isn't a mental illness. And so from my perspective, my early work was in attachment theory. And so I was very much interested in, okay, how much does atypical parenting or the social environment play in contributing to mental illness or mental problems down the road? Over time, I become much more convinced that the social environment has much less to do with mental illness than does just biology and genetics. That's not to say that I've written off attachment or the social environment. It's just that the idea that that could be the primary causal role in so much of the mental illness is really, I don't think it's accurate. So understanding the relative contribution of parenting, the social environment to mental illness and mental disorder is a key thing moving forward that we have to do. And that involves the notion that we talked about earlier, is society sick? And if it is sick and contributing to these disparities, how much of it? But I think the reality of it is it's been way overblown how much the social environment contributes to these problems. And when you have a situation like that where it's way overblown, it can lead to all that leftist activism where we need to just completely undergo a revolution and we need to abolish the institutions and change society rather than focus on the individual.
Are you familiar with the language of the white pill and the red pill and all the various pills?
Yes.
Okay. So as we wrap up, can you leave us on a note of a white pill that you see in maybe American society in particular?
Well, I think the white pill is really best encapsulated by the political wind streams that we're seeing now with the Trump victory and pushing back against some of the lunacy. So whereas before you had this sort of the red pill, then you got the black pill where you were just totally disillusioned that nothing was ever going to change. I think now we're seeing a cultural pushback that is leading to, look, we got to re-straighten out how we think about these things. And we can't run a society where every deviancy and pathology is normalized, where we have men and women spaces, we have men claiming to be women, we have children who are under false pretenses and false cognition destroying their bodies. The detransition movement, I think, has been crucial for that. So I think now the ability to speak freely without fear of reprisal, which is certainly increasing now, is the white pill moving forward. And that's going to percolate not just for mental health, but for all disciplines, that we can finally basically speak the truth without fear of reprisal.
Well, the website is your name, jdhaltigan.com. That's JDHaltigan, just the way it sounds, jdhaltigan.com. I'll link to it on our show notes page, which is tomwoods.com/2592, also in the video description. I kind of envisioned this as being, this would probably just turn into the two of us chit-chatting, but I just had so many things I wanted to ask you that I just went ahead and just started asking you questions. And I really am grateful for your answers and to have had a chance to get to know you. So I appreciate your time and thank you very much.
Well, likewise, Tom, thank you. It's great. And I think, again, this is so important for pushing back, is to have these platforms that allow us to do that. And yours is obviously one. Your presence on Twitter is again, another great way to meet someone and to get the word out and to get more people to see what's happening and change the sort of dysfunction that has come about since, the last couple of decades.
Well, I appreciate that. And thank you once again. I hope people will check out jdhaltigan.com. It's a redirect to your Substack. so they can read
and
the important stuff
certainly,
that you're writing.
if you could too, my X feed, which is where I have a lot of ability and flex to speak out about these issues. So listeners, I would love a follow on there too to get the word out.
Okay, absolutely. I'll post that as well. So thank you very much, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.